Ishmael. And so when Ishmael and Hagar flee, they go to this part of the world. Hagar runs back and forth between two mountains looking for water. The legend is that Ishmael was on a place and sort of tapped the earth, and sure enough, there was water there, and that becomes the site of that black obelisk that you see on television and in pictures, around which Muslim people go 7 times during the Hajj. We don't have time to talk extensively about the Hajj, but every Muslim is to do it once in their lives if they can afford it, if their families are taken care of while they're gone, and there is a whole series of events related to it. Women in Islam. We tend to have a very we have the sense that women are treated the same everywhere in Islam, and that's not true. There are many parts of the world in which Muslim women are not veiled, in which they don't wear the burqa. There are many modern states in the world that are predominantly Muslim. Then you go all the way back to the complete covering of women, depending upon the culture and so forth. There is no doubt that the Quran is quite patriarchal, as you would probably expect in the day in which it is written. But rather like the Bible, it actually offers liberation to women in this context and calls for equal treatment of men and women, even as at other points in the Quran it seems to fly in the face of that. And so you get kind of equal ownership of property and so forth, and then you get a passage like, women are your fields, go into your fields anytime you want to. And there is that kind of tension within the Quran itself. And you have to sort of factor all of that into the equation. Let me talk for just a moment about, remember, every religion has its Protestants and its Catholics, right? All right. Vaishnavites and Shivites, Mahayanists and Theravadists in Hinduism. Well, in Islam, we have the Shiites and the Sunni. If you do not understand the tensions between Shiites and Sunni, everything that is happening in the world right now just went right over your head, and you absolutely missed it. So this is perhaps one of the most important parts of what we talk about today in the time we have left. 20% of Muslims, 15 to 20%, are Shiite. The name means party. Shia Ali, the party of Ali. Shiites believe that it is only direct descendants of Muhammad who ought to be leaders in the Muslim community. Only if you are a blood relative. And for Shiites, there are 12 imams generally, and the last one is called the Mahdi, and the Mahdi has disappeared for a time to reappear just before the judgment, when he will return with Jesus to the earth. Sorry, my PowerPoint keeps hopping ahead. Shiite Islam is known for its veneration of saints and for festivals commemorating the earliest decades of Islam when Muhammad's direct descendants were mistreated. So Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, was murdered by other Muslims, and this created the divide. We'll talk a little bit about it again in a minute. For Sunnis, 80% of Muslims in the world are Sunnis, 85. Sunnah means model or example. So you follow the example of Muhammad. The leaders do not have to be direct descendants. And sure enough, they advocated a follower of Muhammad to succeed him as opposed to a direct descendant. The Sunnis essentially won out in the battle over Muslim succession, and that's led to a lot of conflict within Islam over the centuries. And this next map is the one I want you to pay careful attention to. I don't know how clearly you can see it from where you are, and I apologize for how small it is. But what I want you to notice across here is that the more green the map becomes, the more Sunnis there are in that part of the world. I'm sorry, the more Shiites there are in that part of the world. So the more green it is, the more Shiites. Shiites believe who should succeed Muhammad? Direct descendants. Sunnis believe you don't have to be a direct descendant. So I want you to notice something in this map. You notice how fairly yellow it is across North Africa, Saudi Arabia. As you get up toward Iraq and Iran and Syria and Turkey and Lebanon, it becomes increasingly green, meaning it becomes increasingly what? Shiite. Now, where does all of this meet? Where does the map seem to have a center? Syria and Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, Syria and Iraq. What I would submit to you this morning is that the tensions we're seeing in the Middle East, really, we're only second-tier players in the tension, all right? The tension is between the Protestants and the Catholics. Very important. It's a distinction that we rarely pay attention to. And we do so at our peril. You will notice when we think about something like ISIS, the Islamic State, and we look at Iraq, Saddam Hussein allowed Sunnis to have dominance in Iraq. Once the U.S. came in, deposed Saddam, in time they replaced him with a Shiite government. That Shiite government kept Sunnis from having any authority. That angered a lot of Sunnis, some of whom are extremists and quite violent, and who took advantage of the instability and brought their own violence into the mix to attempt then to take Iraq. And so that really is what we have going on here with ISIS. So you really do have tension between Shiite and Sunni. ISIS possesses right now the city of Mosul. There's going to be a battle. It's going to happen probably in April. In that battle, predominantly Shiite forces are going to be attempting to take Mosul from people who are extremists and violent advocates of a puritanical sect of Sunni Islam. The city of Mosul is predominantly Sunni, and the people of Mosul are afraid that when those Shiites come into Mosul, they are going to work to obliterate everybody who's Sunni, and that they won't make the distinctions between the radicals and the Sunni themselves. And guess what? They could be exactly right. Because you know what happens in war and how we get sort of caught up in the tensions. And so you really can't understand what's going on unless you understand that distinction. A year ago, almost I guess it's been a year and a month now, I found myself in Tehran, which is Shiite or Sunni? Shiite. Tehran, Iran, very Shiite. One of the superpowers in the Middle East. What's the other one? Saudi Arabia. What is Saudi Arabia? Sunni. Sunni Shiite. So between the two, you have a great deal of tension. And we're sort of the prize in the tension. The great fear of, we have been allied with which one of those parties for the last? Saudis. What are the Saudis afraid of? We will ally with Iran, or we will begin to think of the Iranians as good people. They don't want that to happen. And so we get pulled into the tension between the two. I go to Tehran at the invitation of the Iranian government and with a group called U.S. Academics for Peace. By the way, that's the view from my hotel room, which wasn't a bad place to be, actually. U.S. Academics for Peace. We meet with a think tank of the Iranian government, the foreign ministry. It's very interesting because you may not know, Iran had an election a year and a half ago. Ahmadinejad was replaced by Rouhani. Rouhani, much more moderate, much more open to the West. And we heard from our Iranian friends, please help your government to at least be open to dialogue. And you all know we're still trying to work out some sort of agreement over nuclear facilities and so forth in Iran. It was a very interesting experience. And I could just go on and on about that, but I won't because of our time. Let me say in conclusion a couple of things. You hear a lot about a couple of concepts in Islam to which you and I ought to have some knowledge. One of them is Sharia law. This is the effort, the desire to bring about a society which conforms to religious law. And there's a whole tradition of Sharia law within Islam. There are various ways in which Sharia law is understood. It is not that we are, if Sharia law were to be invoked in a country, it would mean that all law in that country fell under, say, the Quran, which is how it works in Saudi Arabia, where the Quran is actually the constitution of the country. But if you go to other parts of the world that are Muslim, you can have secular governments in which religious courts exist to govern things like divorce and other family-related matters. But when it comes to criminal law, that is the affair of a secular state. So you sort of have these wide extremes. Sharia law, you follow the letter of the law. Somebody steals, you cut off their hand. You stone them if they commit adultery, so forth and so on. Practicing the letter of the law. So Sharia law, there's some flexibility within it. There are governments in which it is, the law of the land. And then there are places like Indonesia and Malaysia and other places where Sharia courts exist to carry out the legalities of family life and so forth. So it's quite a wide variety. We hear a lot about jihad, and jihad is often misused by radical Muslim extremists to indicate a violent struggle like ISIS is carrying out to create a world that is Muslim. That's the goal. Every place ISIS goes, the idea is the government ceases to exist and falls under the aegis of the Islamic State. The word jihad refers to struggle. The inward struggle, mainly, the struggle to submit to God. So it's a personal struggle. It's also the struggle against those who would oppose Islam. It's been interpreted in Islamic history as primarily a defensive struggle, but it also takes upon itself overtones of an offensive struggle. Let me close by simply offering a kind of word about Islam as a faith itself. The one thing that is incumbent upon you and me in this day and age is to get to know a Muslim person. I'm so glad so many of you have done that already. I hope you will continue to cultivate those sorts of relationships with each other. The reality is that's what helps us to move beyond the objectification that each of us sort of places upon the other. Islam is in the middle of a huge revolution. And I would submit to you that what we are seeing with ISIS is one manifestation of a huge struggle that is going on with Islam as it goes through the same thing we Christians did in the 16th century with the Reformation. It is possible for Islam to come out on the other side of this as a much more open and moderate religion. But that is going to require that those of us who are outside of it do our very best to understand it, to befriend those who are in it, and that we listen to a whole range of sources of information about Islam. I have a lot of folks say to me, well, Muslim people never condemn all the terrible stuff that's going on. That is not the case. Perhaps we wish they would condemn it more. But I subscribe to a service that sends to me every week video, news reports, and so forth from the Muslim world. And I can assure you that Saudi Arabians and Egyptians and Iraqis and Iranians are condemning what they see going on. In fact, at this point, they are as frightened and scared of it as we are. And we witnessed some of that in the last couple of weeks with the beheadings of the Egyptians in Libya and the response of the Egyptian government to that with airstrikes into Libya itself. So that radical wing is actually starting to serve as a kind of call to response in the Muslim world. And I think there's a great deal of hope that we will see a moderate Islam gradually express itself. In the meantime, we've got to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves in this thing. We have time for 2 questions. Yes, sir. Wait a minute. Let me go with this, and then I'll come to that one. Yes, sir. The reality is, in Islam, any depiction of human beings is considered taboo in the context of worship. It is one way of sort of buying or cementing tawhid, or the worship of the one true God. So we'll put nothing up except perhaps calligraphy that is text from the Quran. Now, again, back to the differences between Sunni and Shiite, the reality is Shiites, actually the Ayatollah Khomeini had an image of Muhammad in his house in Tehran. Shiites are much more open to those images than are Sunni and the extreme puritanical form called Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. When it comes to a depiction of Muhammad, I think part of the challenge is the blasphemous depiction and a concern that we in the West have not condemned that, and that our religious freedom is going to allow that kind of thing to happen rampantly. And so here we get the violence and the extremism with what happened in Paris and elsewhere. There are conversations in Islam about how to be more open and more engaging, but in the same way that we would castigate, some sort of depiction of the crucifixion that was sacrilegious. They're struggling to do that as well. And so I don't minimize at all what happened. In fact, my hope is that we can somehow foster within Islam more openness to images of Muhammad as we go. And one more question here, and I think...
Sunnis comprise about 20% of the vote.
80, yeah, they're the larger. Sunni, yeah.
Sunnis, 20%. What percent of them, 20, are these extremists?
Yeah, the Sunnis are actually 80%. They're the larger group, 80 to 85%. The Shiites are the smaller, 15 to 20. What percentage? That's sort of a hard question. It is a very small percentage. I can't stand here and give you a number. It's a very, very small percentage. There is in Saudi Arabia perhaps the most puritanical advocates of the tradition, and they've created a society there that sort of follows the letter of the law, and women can't drive, and there are all sorts of rules and regulations. But the extremists, I can assure you, are a very small percentage of Sunni Muslims. All right, one more and then we'll call it. About Iran and... Yeah. Well, interesting you should ask that question. When I was in Iran, I went to the U.S. Embassy, stood outside the front of it, and sort of written on the walls were phrases like "death to the infidel," what was it, "death to the USA" or something like that. I went around to that sign, and there was an orange vendor standing in front of it, and I asked him if he could move his cart so I could take a picture of that sign, and I did that. And people were strolling along. It was a nice sort of Sunday afternoon in the park, and I got back to the U.S., and I turned on CNN, and about 10 days later, a CNN reporter is standing in front of that wall at the same sign I'd been standing in front of. And he's standing there and he's saying, "Oh, you can just feel the tension. It's just, there's lots of hostility from the Iranians here, and we are just not quite sure how safe we are in this place." And all of it was false. None of that was happening whatsoever. That's CNN. That's not Fox. That's CNN. And so you do have, almost in a sort of museum-like thing, this stuff. You do have people who scream death to the infidel. But you also have, in the marketplace, the guy who comes up to me and says, this is in the Tehran souk, our market, where are you from? And I said, I'm from the United States. I kind of swallow hard. He says, man, where have you been? We've been waiting for you for 30 years. We're so glad you're back. Something like 3 Americans a day enter Iran. So you can see some of the source of his happiness and joy that we were back. My point is not that people don't shout death to the infidel. My point is that most people don't. And I'm sorry? There certainly are references to, in warfare, killing the infidel. But again, you sort of have to come back to the context, which most people don't do when they're reading the Quran. And so people find in it justification for whatever action that they want to take. Well, I'm going to stop there. We're going to have church here in a few minutes, and I need to get out of the way. But I do want to thank you again. You've been a great audience. You've listened. You've been open, and I'm grateful for your presence.